Tag Heuer has produced some iconic watches, none more iconic than the Monaco. The Monaco has come in myriad sizes, styles, and colorways, but there's a consistent theme. It has a rectangular case with a rather interesting dial. The one I've got here has a brown iridescent dial, which has something of a sunburst effect depending on the lighting. It also has a pinstriped section down the middle, which contains the Tag Heuer logo, a date complication, and a small seconds sub-dial. It also has diamond markers. This particular watch also comes with a rather unique python leather strap, which adds a degree of uniqueness and interestingness to the watch. Now this particular watch is available for sale at the moment. I've listed it for auction on Grailsy, which is a great site where you can get a ton of different watches. You can check that out using the link in the description below. But when it sells, I'll also include links to other watches that you might want to check out. So let's dig into the Tag Heuer Monaco. Now this particular Monaco has a 37mm case. It wears, however, a little bit bigger. So it wears similarly to a Cartier Tank XL, for example. And when placed to the Cartier Tank XL, the XL sometimes looks a little bit smaller. But this likely comes down to the dimensions. The Tag Heuer Monaco is a little bit more square, whereas the Tank XL is a little bit more rectangular. Nevertheless, it wears like a reasonably sized watch. It's around 12mm thick. Now, like I've said, I wear a Cartier Tank XL, and this fits me perfectly well. Now, the case's finishing is also pretty pleasant. So, for example, in the front of the case, it has a shiny stainless steel appearance. It has Tag Heuer stamped in the bottom right-hand side. The front of the case is perfectly nice enough. The rear of the case has a brushed stainless steel finish, and it's got Tag Heuer, the model details, and the logo stamped onto the back of the case. It's a relatively normal closed case back, which is relatively unsurprising given the movement in question. Now if we look at the front of the case, we can see a slightly beveled layout here, where it bevels off into a slightly curved side onto the rectangular case. It has a rather nice appearance, and is a little bit more interesting than just a base rectangle. Turning around to the crown, well, the crown has Tag Heuer stamped onto the crown, and it has some texturing for some additional grip. However, the crown is a pull-out crown. You don't need to screw it to undo it. Now the watch functions like it ordinarily would. You pull it out and you can adjust the time and you can adjust the date like you would ordinarily adjust a watch. Now the watch notionally has hacking in that the second hand stops when you pull the crown out. However, being a quartz movement, that isn't terribly surprising. And like I've said, setting the date and time functions exactly how you would expect. The dial, however, is a particular highlight. It has a reddish-brown iridescent effect. It shimmers in the light and it varies a little bit in terms of its color depending on the light you've got on it. The dial nicely reflects the light and it changes subtly as the lighting changes. Now the dial also has a pinstripe pattern down the middle, which helps to add interest but also add textural integrity to the dial, by which I mean it helps to draw the dial together and stop it looking too cluttered. For example, in the middle of the watch, you've got the date, you've got the Tag Heuer logo, you've got the name being Monaco, and then at the bottom, you've got the small dial for the small seconds. You need to draw all of these together to avoid it looking too cluttered, which is what the textured pinstripe effect down the middle ultimately does. It helps to draw everything together. Now this particular watch has diamond markers from the factory. There are 13 diamonds, which sum to about 0.08 carats in total. They come directly from the factory. They help to add a degree of sparkle and niceness to the dial, make it a little bit more interesting than it would otherwise be. However, diamonds, of course, are not to everyone's taste. Now, the dial features two complications, so to speak. We've got the date, which is near the 12 o'clock hand, which functions, like I've said, like an ordinary date. We've also got the small second subdial, which is a square, much like you would find in a normal Tag Heuer Monaco. And like in all of these Monacos, it has rounded off corners. It looks quite nice. However, like I've indicated, to draw together the date and the Tag Heuer logo and the small seconds, this textured pinstripe effect in the middle helps to make that look a little bit more cohesive and a little bit less cluttered than it would otherwise be. The hands are relatively standard. They have a slight see-through effect in the middle, although the see-through bit doesn't actually seem to help you actually see the time any better, but nevertheless, it adds some interest. The hands have some lume, but I don't think this is going to be very easy for you to read in the dark, so I wouldn't be counting on actually using that lume for anything particularly practical. Now the watch comes with two straps. The default one is a python leather strap, which is rather unique because it will differ between watches. I think it helps to add a degree of interest to the watch, making the watch not the same as every other watch that is out there. However, there is also a bronze strap, which I think is much less interesting than the python leather one. Now the python leather one can be a little bit polarizing. It's certainly rather out there, it's very vibrant, it's certainly a statement. It's nice to have the python leather strap, but of course it won't be to everyone's taste. Fortunately, it is easy to swap out. You could swap it out for a black leather strap, for example, or a brown leather strap, or for a bracelet. It's relatively easy to interchange. However, I happen to kind of like it just because it's a little bit different, and not every watch needs to look the exact same, and not every watch needs to come on a black leather strap. The thing that I do really like about it, however, is the actual patterning will differ between watches and between straps, which helps to make it a little bit more unique than would otherwise be the case. The clasp itself is an ordinary deployment clasp, which has the Tag Heuer logo stamped onto it. It functions exactly like you would expect from such a clasp. There's nothing particularly to say otherwise about it, but it functions nicely enough and it works and it's easy enough to wear. The movement is a quartz movement. Now apparently it has 5 jewels and is based on a Ronda 702. The advantage, of course, with all of these quartz movements is they're relatively robust, they keep time accurately, they're very easy to use, you don't need to worry about wearing it to keep the watch going. However, quartz watches aren't necessarily to everyone's taste. One of the major advantages, however, is it is very, very easy to maintain and or service if you need to do so. I had it done on this watch and it was very, very inexpensive. So that's something you might want to bear in mind. You don't have thousands of dollars of servicing fees when you're actually wearing this watch. And to some extent, there's a role for having a watch like that. Not every watch needs to be an automatic watch. Some watches can be quartz, and that is perfectly fine. So what then is my overall verdict on the Tag Heuer Monaco? Well, I quite like the Tag Heuer Monaco, but there's only so many square watches you actually need in your collection. Now in terms of this particular watch, like I've said, it's one that you would want to consider. I'm selling this watch on Grailsy, an auction house which is really rather useful if you're looking to buy a watch. Go and check that out. I'll include a link to that in the description below for you to go and see the watch. However, even if they weren't selling this watch, I would still encourage you to at least consider it. Not everyone will necessarily want the python leather strap. However, you can swap that out for almost anything else, be it a brown leather or black leather strap, or for a bracelet. It's easy to swap out that if you don't want that polarizing appearance. And if you put on something more sedate, it will certainly be just an ordinary dress watch, which is rather nice. And like I've said with the dial, with the pinstripe effect, with this iridescent brown, and with the diamond markers, it's again a little bit different from other watches, and if paired with a sedate strap, it's going to actually be relatively subtle. Relatively subtle, but still relatively interesting. So certainly I would consider it even if I weren't looking to sell the watch. And when it sells, I'll include some links to this in the description below anyway. Now there are some alternative watches you might want to consider. However, there aren't really any perfect substitutes because all of the other watches have slightly different dials or slightly different shapes, but there are still some that are somewhat similar. So for example, there's a Cartier Tank or a Cartier Santos, which have some broad similarities to the Monaco. Either a square or a rectangular shape, similar size, similar functions. You might want to check those out. I quite like the brand. Also, you can consider the Bell & Ross, either BRS92 or the BR05. Both of those have more of a square shape and are more similar to the Monaco than they are some of the other, perhaps a little bit more modern looking Bell & Ross watches. So you might want to consider those as well. However, again, a lot of that will depend on price, which you can pick those up for. One thing to bear in mind, however, is the brand Bell & Ross is not quite as well known as Tag Heuer, and therefore when you go to sell it, it might be a little bit more difficult. Similar to the Nomos Tetra, again, it's more of a square watch, but Nomos is not as well known. Though I quite like the brand, it has a rather interesting aesthetic. Its aesthetic ties throughout all of its watches. I'd be interested in checking that out, but again, that one's going to be a little bit difficult for you to sell if you ever needed to do so, just due to the brand not really being that well known. Finally, you might also consider the Hermes H08. Now, I'm not necessarily a big fan of Hermes watches. However, for the Hermes H08, I actually think it looks quite nice. Hermes is stepping up its game in terms of watches, and also maybe if you buy it brand new from a boutique, you might pick up some points you can actually go out and buy a bag eventually. Although the sales assistant probably won't actually take down your name, so it probably won't actually make any difference. But in any case, those are some alternatives you might want to consider. So my overall verdict, worth considering the Tag Heuer Monaco, in particular worth considering a watch of this nature. You can check it out using the link in the description below. But otherwise, let me know your thoughts on the watch, and hopefully I see you next time as well.